I wanted to begin with the question of, so what? That's what we ended with in the last class for myths number 1, 2, and 3. And I wanted to start out with it for myths 4, 5, and 6 to kind of give us a flavor of what is to come. I find that when I'm reading historical or anthropological accounts, at times you can get kind of lost in the details. Like, how many times can he say miscommunication in chapter 5? It was a lot. So before we get into all that stuff, let's zoom out a little bit and think of the big points, or what I hope I would like to suggest are some big points. Myth number 4, the myth of completion. For me, I think this means that we always have to watch out for ideas that everything's all wrapped up. It's all completed. It's all tidy. And this is especially true, perhaps it's true in our own lives, but I think it is especially true when we think about military operations. We often depict these still to this day as sort of things that happen on maps, and you'll see these diagrams of tanks and soldiers, and then they'll unfurl a big banner and the politicians will come out and say, mission accomplished, or the war is over, or we won. And this has been a problem for the United States, and it keeps becoming an issue. It was an issue in the invasion of Iraq and the supposed the war in Afghanistan, which we've now said we're done with. But I mean, there were times when we were like, oh yeah, we got it all under control. We got it wrapped up, completed. And you just have to be really careful with that, with those ideas, because war is messy, and it's never, I don't know, even if it's over, even if you say you won, like how many people had to die before you can say we won? Doesn't help the people who were gone. So just be careful of these abstractions and ideas like that. Myth number 5. I think this comes in 2 parts. First part is that, people come in all sorts and varieties and speak different languages and have different genders and perspectives and races and ethnicities and cultural backgrounds. And sometimes we feel like there's no hope, that we're just talking past each other, that husbands and wives are unable to talk to each other because their perspectives on life are so different, or that the perspective on life from being Black or being white in the United States is so different that there's no hope that you can communicate across this divide. And I think that there's always, because we're human beings, because we do try to communicate, there's always some room for understanding. We're not actually from different planets or different species. We can communicate, but that does lead to lesson 5B, which is not to assume that our communication is therefore going to be perfect. And just because I say something to you, it is completely understood, and just because you're nodding your heads doesn't mean that what exactly I thought I was saying is being interpreted the exact same way. So we should always be aware that people are going to interpret things from their own understanding and their own place, and that's all right. That doesn't mean we're not communicating at all, but it also doesn't mean that only one perspective counts and everybody understands that. And then in chapter 6, or myth number 6, this is an ongoing issue, and it happens in the United States too all the time. This assumption that the native peoples, the Native Americans or the indigenous peoples, were once here, but they're all gone. They're done now. Or if they're not gone, they're about to go away, that they're disappearing. In some ways, we might say despite the losses that have occurred and the true amount, the magnitude of the losses, that the opposite is true. But just watch out for that. So these to me are kind of the big so what questions that are bigger ideas from these three myths 4, 5, and 6, which we'll talk about in detail. In the afterword to Restall's book, this book was published in 2003, and then he revisited in 2020. Somebody has the book. Yeah, let's see, Megan, go to the afterword. Go as far as you can before the notes. Is there an afterword in there? What's the very last page of the afterword? I don't know because I have it electronically, but 174. If you look in your book on page 174, what do you have there, Amy? What do I have? Boy, I just have notes. Huh? Oh, the permissions. That's always important. You have to really read over those. In the afterword on page 174, I think this is where it is. Does he have a little section that says making it matter? His last section, making it matter. This to me is what I call the so what. Who cares? Making it matter. And I think if I read this afterward correctly, the very last page of it, Restall says that he didn't care that much about making it matter. Not that he didn't care, but that wasn't a huge concern. He was just trying to give us the details, the stuff. And so in this part, he talks about the ways in which it matters. And I think they somewhat correspond to what I've been trying to tell you as the so what. So I'm not going to say that I was thinking of this before Restall, but, I think I was. And so what does he say in Making It Matter? He says that one of the reasons this history matters is because of how much this invasion, this conquest, this war, the practices of carrying out war were part of a template which would then become a template for all kinds of invasions and colonizations and warfare. And he says that we are still struggling with the monster that is warfare. That was in 2020. I think that for those of us who have been looking around at our television screens for the last year, almost year, know that this is true and that this is something that you would think we would have figured out ways to not do as much anymore, but apparently not. So we're struggling with the monster that is warfare. And I think one of the reasons we struggle with that is we make these claims about territories and places on the map, and we want to believe that we occupy them and that we control them or that we should control them. And we end up sending young people into terrible fates and visiting people with terrible displacements and refugees and all those things. We're still struggling with it. And a lot of that was laid out for us 500 years ago, more, but it really got played out in the conquest. And he also writes that, along with warfare, with the racist and nationalist ideologies upon which it feeds, draws from, right? So these kinds of things and in many ways, the conquest of the Americas, the encounter between European and American societies in this time was part of gives us our modern notions of both what race is. We'll talk about this later when we talk about the Caribbean, and what nation is. We talked about in the last class how before this time that the Spaniards probably didn't really think of themselves as Spaniards because they were just starting to come into this notion of nationhood, and it was defined against what they were witnessing and perceiving in the Americas. So a lot of our modern ideas about race, our modern ideas about nation, and the ways in which people will go to war for those ideas are really rooted in some of these conquest myths and ideas. And then at the last part of the afterword, this part about indigenous or native peoples, he writes that we need to ponder how and why racist stereotypes generated during and after the wars of the conquest era have survived for 5 centuries. That's for sure. I mean, how is it that after 500 years, people still have racist stereotypes about indigenous peoples, Native Americans? How come? So that's a good thing to ponder, and we have to be careful of these assumptions and stereotypes. And I think maybe this is the very last word that he says in 2020, and what impact that has had on how indigenous peoples are viewed and treated today. So our ideas about what it means to be an indigenous person or Native American still have impact in the kinds of policies, laws, treatment that that is visited upon people in today's world. So, wow, that's a lot of text. So much text. Try not to have so much text on all my slides, but there it is. So the big questions that again are big why questions in myths 4, 5, and 6, which like I said, I believe corresponds to what Restall talks about in his very last page on Making It Matter, page 174. All right, so let's go into the actual myths. The myths, we'll spend most of our time on the chapter 4, the myth of completion, where most of you spent most of your time. The myth of completion. So the myth of completion is basically that, it could be summed up as this claim that the conquest was over quickly. Spaniards won and defeated the indigenous populations and wrapped it all up and founded their towns and erected some crosses and built some things, and it's all done. And they did it. That's it. Now, I think we should first ask ourselves why this myth came to be. There's a time lag trying to explore these places, and you're relying on rumors and all those things, but why would you then claim that you did it? Why do these people all write, hey, all done, huh? The king, yes, right. Going back to that, have to get approval from the king. And so that's why Columbus was like, I did it. I made it to Asia. Now give me the money, right? Now give me my titles. Now give me my governorship, right? So there was an incentive among perhaps all the conquistadors to overclaim success, right? That I vanquished all these odds, and now I did it, and so I deserve money, fame, governing, all those things. So there's hundreds, thousands of documents that were written from this perspective to the king and to other political leaders claiming that they did it. It's all done. That's one reason. One is the idea, if they claimed it was now peaceful, right? That it was done and peaceful. Let's put it this way. Let's say we're at peace, and then all of a sudden somebody gets riled up and does something. What am I then justified to do? We're all calm, and then you go off and hit me. What should I be able to do then? Kill you, hit you back, right? So, the reason they wanted to claim it was all peaceful was because then you could say that if anybody did anything, it was a revolt against established authority rather than an ongoing war conflict, right? Because those fall under different rules. If you're just a rebel, just a person resisting, then the government is authorized to crush you, even in our society. If you're at war, then there's a whole different set of rules that you follow. And so the Spaniards had an interest in declaring that it's all done, and the remaining people are not soldiers, they're rebels, they're revolters, they're terrorists, right? They're being mean. This thing is done, it's all at peace, and now they're messing things up. So that was another reason to draw on God to help you out there. Keep people, make sure and then if God's will is to do this, then again, anybody that's resisting it is a rebel against not just you, but God. We do with those people, the heathens, you don't want them around, resisting God. So yes, this was the myth. And what Restall wants us to understand is that the reality of this was that it was a process. It was not immediately complete. It took centuries. And in some ways, we could say that it was never completed. It was never done. Obviously, it was a huge undertaking and a huge process, but the idea that it was done and all done, and the places on the map corresponded to actual things that the Spaniards were doing, is a myth, is a claim which we should be careful to not follow. So one of the things that that we see, and we saw this from the first conquest procedure, or when in this case Restall talks about when the Pope divided up, he just picked a line on the map and said, to the east of this line, everything belongs to Portugal. And that's why we see this part of Brazil and speaking Portuguese. So this ends up belonging to Portugal from about here over. And to the west of that line, everything else belongs to Spain. And so, there's this division of the world, and so people came to feel that claiming things for the church or claiming things for the Pope was the same as having that possession. And this is an interesting map because it talks about the European claims in America around the year 1700, and you can kind of see what's going on here, in that you have the Portuguese claiming this part of Brazil, you have the Spaniards exploring and claiming most of this purple part, but you're starting to get some British claims and the 13 colonies, and of course some French claims up there in Canada where they still speak French, and down in New Orleans where they used to speak French. Some British claims also in what is now Belize, or what used to be called Western or British Honduras. So there's some interesting things going on in this map. But what it speaks to is something that Restall talks about, is that when it came down to it, really the Spaniards, especially in other places, only had tentative control over a pretty small core areas. And so they would overthrow, let's say, what is now Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, or I'm sorry, blanking. They would overthrow the Inca capital, and then they'd claim that they took control over everything. When in fact, for the most part, there was all these places that were still basically not being controlled. And even in those places which they did control, there were often revolts or rebellions or wars against them, which we saw in the first film of the last great Inca rebellion. So in some ways, these claims were, in some of these areas, the core areas were perhaps under more control, but the other areas were not necessarily part of that control. And one of the other things I would like to point out about this map is that the borders that we have now, it could have gone quite differently than what we see today. There was nothing really predestined in the idea that these British colonies would then expand out over here all the way to places called California and San Jose and San Francisco and all those places that actually were founded, or the cities that were founded by the Spanish. These borders could have been quite different, and history is always complicated that way. So this is one point about the control of the core, and it leads to an interesting issue with the idea of Spanish control. So Felicia, if you were angry and fed up with living under Spanish rule, what could you do? Rebel. So one thing you could do is rebel, but what else could you do? You could leave, right? And so this is something that we don't know about because it's not sort of in the official books, but there were all kinds of areas which Restall calls fringe, or areas that were really outside of anybody's control. They had relative autonomy, and all this whole Amazon basin, much of the Andes. I just put in much of this southern Argentina and Chile. A lot of the smaller Caribbean islands were homes for enslaved Africans who then escaped and basically set up their own societies on these islands and these parts. And you could draw lots of little tiny circles all over the place. I should probably put in much of what is now northern Mexico or in the southern US. They really weren't governed by the Spanish, and for many years the people there were either doing what they had been doing, or they may have been influenced by European control, but didn't consider that to be that much of a big deal. So this is a really interesting thing that we should keep in mind when we think about the so-called conquest and the ways in which these lines were drawn on the map. By the way, this is the area of, around this area, the borders between what is now Paraguay, Brazil, Bolivia would be the borderline areas of the mission. As you can tell, there's a border dispute between that has been resolved in terms of the national boundaries, the agreements between the King of Portugal and the King of Spain, but is not quite resolved in terms of who would be able to take control of the church, or what if the church would fall under the protection of whom in this area. So again, this is an area of relative autonomy. Now, we want to be careful not to over-romanticize these areas. Not everyone gets to escape and leave. So we have to, it's not necessarily that everybody was just free and clear. If you could just make it out, and even in these areas, that doesn't mean necessarily that things are wonderful for you. So that's one caveat. And the other thing I would say is that eventually, when people did conquer these areas, and Restall mentioned some of these things and what happened in southern and northern Argentina in the 19th century, in Chile, some of the most terrible and brutal things that were done to people were done in the name of getting rid of these autonomous areas, trying to bring them under the control of the state. And so not to give away the end of the mission, but we will see some of the most brutal stuff that is done in order to make people behave. Again, but this is eventually, right? This may have taken 200 or 300 years later. So it may be generations of people who are able to live out their lives in relative autonomy and peace. But eventually these areas, a lot of them did get decimated by the nation state. So a third point that Restall makes is about the role of native elites, or the people who had been prominent in indigenous societies, perhaps high up in the Inca or the Aztec or other native structures before the conquest. And they were often the people who were also running the colonial enterprise. The Spaniards, in many ways, needed them and wanted them to be intermediaries. They didn't necessarily want to have direct rule. They wanted to have people under their control. And so they often relied upon these native elites. there's a bit of a paradox here in that the native elites were the ones who were most thoroughly trusted, being the interpreters and translators and tax collectors of the Americas. But as Restall points out, there were lots of revolts and rebellions and all kinds of discontent with the Spanish Empire. And oftentimes the native elites would be the ones who would throw their lot in with the rebellion or lead those rebellions as well. So they kind of played a double role. They were the negotiators for the conquest, but they also were often the leaders of the rebellion. So what this all adds up to, I think, for Restall and for us is a very, if we want to say it was a conquest, it's certainly not complete. It's very incomplete, extending to even some interesting details like Megan, you noticed, and extending to how people, what they wore even. Restall noted that if the clothing was too scanty, like perhaps some of the clothing in the mission, the church got all mad and would make them wear trousers instead of loincloths. But they weren't that, it wasn't that demanding. And as Restall says, some of the native clothing styles were even adopted by the colonizers, at least in the home. And if you look even today in places like the indigenous clothing of, say, people in Otavalo, Ecuador, there's actually a lot of colonial elements mixed in with what might have been pre-colonial elements. And they have a very distinctive costume, which is in distinction to the nation state and the people who wear sort of Western style, what we call European style clothes. So this is something that was, never completely, it's not that it remained the same, but it never was completely transformed by the Spaniards. And as Restall notes on the same page, that one of the evidences that the conquest was never complete is that 300 or 400 years later, in the 19th century, so say the 1800s, when most of these places became independent, so Mexico, Ecuador, Guatemala, we could go through all the names. When they became independent and were trying to build a national identity, this became an obsession of the national elites, is how to civilize the indigenous population or the Indians. And so Restall gives this as a kind of final example that obviously the Spanish hadn't completed their so-called transformation or their conquest, because 300 years later, people are still trying to figure out how to bring people into what they thought of as the modern nation state that they were building. So, like I said, this is I think a very important chapter, because it helps to counter some of the claims that are made about completeness, and is still relevant for those of us who imagine we want to conquer other peoples and invade them and tell them what to do. All right. The myth of miscommunication. This is a hard chapter. Amy's shaking her head. It's a long chapter and a difficult chapter. I don't know what to say about it. Say the same thing. If you got stuck somewhere in the middle of it, you might just have to skip up to chapter 7. A little back and forth in this chapter, I guess. All right. I guess that's what communication is, back and forth. Why does he put miscommunication? Why does he put that miss in parentheses like that? Why not just call it? Yeah. Yeah, now he's playing around with this here. He's being so cute. I think it's because I think there's two myths here, right? So one of them is the myth of communication, right? The idea that, and I think, Liam, you took one of the things you quoted was the idea that they were just completely understanding each other and they didn't even need an interpreter, right? And so this is the idea that they understand, and since they understand, we can do whatever we want. And as Restall says, it went with the idea, or it helped to support the idea that the natives were subjugated, co-opted, and converted. So it goes with the myth of completion, right? If they are all speaking Spanish or speaking whatever language and they completely understand you, that's not actually what's happening, is what he says, is this idea that there was complete communication between them. But he also is going with the myth there, and this is where I think things get perhaps more complicated than they need to be for our purposes, which is the myth of miscommunication, which is the idea that they couldn't understand each other at all, that they were simply living in two completely different worlds. They were ships passing in the night. They may as well have been from Mars and Venus, and so they would never understand each other. And I talked about this as one of the big ideas that, you have to be careful, this idea that two perspectives can never understand each other and they're from two different species or stuff like that. And so he's arguing against this too. He's saying that no, there were translators, there were people who were interpreting, there were people going back and forth, there were people on both sides learning each other's language. And so it may have not have been a perfect communication, but it wasn't a perfect not communication, miscommunication either. As a kind of auxiliary to this, I want to talk about indigenous languages and the persistence of indigenous languages, which is something that sometimes when we think about Latin America and the Caribbean, people don't talk about as much, because there was a ton of language loss during the conquest in North and South America, and still to this day, there was an enormous variety of languages, and some of those we will never know because their inhabitants were basically wiped out. And so by the fact that there was so much loss of life over time, lots of languages were lost, and we don't want to diminish the magnitude of loss that occurred. But on the other hand, some indigenous languages, a few examples, Quechua in highland South America and the Andes, Tupi-Guarani, Nahuatl in Mexico, became languages that the priests were told to use and used as conversion languages. So as Restall says, the Catholic Church didn't say that everybody had to learn Spanish and read the Bible in Spanish, perhaps in part because they were still reading in Latin, so who wanted to learn that? And they did a lot of translation and extension of church doctrine in indigenous languages. And so some of these languages actually grew beyond where they were before the colonial period. They actually expanded or increased in number. And a lot of people don't realize how much in the Americas are often typified as, the place where you speak Spanish, English, French, Portuguese. Is that it? Yeah, mostly those languages. But in fact, indigenous, and you don't have to copy this down, you just have to think about it. There are millions of people. This is simply the top 5 indigenous languages. So Quechua is probably one of the largest, one of the languages of around where the Inca Empire was, but again, extended out now. About 8 million speakers. Various Mayan languages spoken in Mexico and Guatemala, about 6 million speakers. Guarani, which is we're seeing some examples of in the film, is actually an official language of Paraguay today and is spoken as a first or second language by around 5 million people. Aymara, another Andean language, is spoken in Peru and Bolivia, about 2.5 million, and Nahuatl in Mexico, which is not something that most people think of, but an indigenous language there. So again, one doesn't want to underestimate the amount of language that was lost, but it's also interesting how much has persisted, survived, and extends today. Which brings us to myth number 6, the myth of desolation, or the idea that the indigenous peoples are all going away, are gone or going away, disappearing. And it's hard to get to this chapter because it got stuck somewhere in 4 or 5. So I'll just mention a couple points from it. Again, Restall brings up here that people were not completely eliminated. The Spanish often didn't want to have direct control. They wanted to have intermediaries, and so they depended upon native elites to run various things, their farms and possessions, and they ended up having quite a bit of everyday control. And then toward the end of this chapter, there's this incredible quote, and I want to spend a little bit of time with it because it's just so different from what we think about. It's on page 123. And we talked about the importance of native allies or indigenous allies in the conquest and in the later conquest battles. But Restall sort of goes further than that here, and he says that in some ways, the later conquest stages, or the later stages of this battle, were actually indigenous peoples or native armies who might have been fighting alongside or with Spaniards, but might have, in some cases, preserved their own officers and their own structure. And as evidence for this, is we might need to interpret this a little bit because it's hard to visualize. As symbolized by place names in highland Guatemala to this day, Nahuatl became lingua franca in New Spain. So let's go back a little bit. So if you think about where Mexico is and Mexico City today, that would have been the sort of capital of what was the Aztec Empire, and then becomes the capital of what was called New Spain. And Nahuatl is the indigenous language there. And so as we talked about, Nahuatl becomes, well, he puts it as lingua franca, which technically means the French language, which comes to us from back in the day when everybody used to speak French. So it was called lingua franca because everywhere you go, if you spoke French, you could talk to people. So interesting. So, just a little background to say what happened is Nahuatl, and it sort of becomes, because as we talked about Catholic missionization and the expansion, Nahuatl actually expands. And so he says, in many ways, these campaigns were a continuation of the Mexica expansionism. Or what he's saying is that the indigenous peoples that had formed what we might think of as the Aztecs were continuing their expansion, but under the so-called banners or the rule of the sanction of the Spanish. And so in some cases, not all, but in an interesting cases, there were indigenous or native projects that continued, and people don't realize it, but they were still expanding their ways or their empire or their influence, even though they were technically under Spanish control. So here is where Restall ends up myth number 6, or completes myth number 6, by saying that in fact people did not just simply go away and disappear, and were perhaps more important than we think. Like I said, most of us got stuck, but then Regina somehow bounced up there chapter 6 to talk to us about cannibalism. Reflecting a little bit on this cannibalism thing, because it is a term that perhaps comes to us from the Caribs in the Caribbean, is the probable place that Columbus got this idea and then took it back to Europe, that people were cannibals. They were eaters of human flesh. And so this is a term that comes to us most probably from this encounter in the Americas, and the idea that they were eating people. And this is an idea that is employed around the world because cannibalism becomes a European obsession. That was like one of the first questions that they would have, or the first things that they would want to know about other peoples is, are you eating each other? Was basically what the Europeans were obsessed with this, in part because they thought other people were doing this, and it made their conquest justified. And so various anthropologists, I have a book title here from Ganana Obayasekari called Cannibal Talk, have talked about how, just as Regina told us, that a lot of these accounts were exaggerated or misinterpreted. They were based on secondhand accounts. And in part, it has to do with this, we might call it the myth of the ideas of communication and miscommunication. And I think I've probably done this for some of you in other classes, but it's always fun. How would you, if you really wanted to know if somebody was a cannibal in another society which you were entering into for the first time and didn't speak the language, how would you ask them if they were a cannibal? What are you doing, Marcus? What is that? You're biting your arm. You're miming, right? You don't speak the language, but you're biting your arm. And yeah, if we all look at Marcus while he does this, what do we now think about Marcus? He's the cannibal, right? And so the first thing you're like, wait, what? Have you come here to eat us? Because that's not what we want. That's not what we were looking for. Right. So there's lots of miming, and people are trying to figure out if the Europeans are about to eat them, or what they're even talking about. Because miming cannibalism really doesn't work very well, right? So, but once people figured this out, well, I mean, there were also counter accusations, because they really did feel that the Europeans had come to cannibalize them, and in some cases they weren't entirely incorrect. But once people figured this out, they also used it. Like, they're like, oh no, we don't do that. But those guys over there, they're bad. They're cannibals. Go get them. Or alternatively, they would say, yeah, we do that. You stay away from us, man. We're going to eat you. You'll be in trouble. So a lot of this had to do with, again, as Regina said, it's used to justify the conquest, to make it seem like what you're doing is justified by God, and to civilize the savages. But it also has this, it can be used to frighten people away if you don't want to see them. And it can be used to manipulate people, or talk about how you yourself are now freed of cannibalism, and now we're all good here. So like I said, cannibalism became, it's not that nobody ever ate each other. There's documented cases that this happens even in US and society, but in general, the idea that people did this on a regular basis was much exaggerated, in part because of this obsession with proving that people were bad.